Welcome to Shadow of Truth, and today is Thursday, May the 26th, 2016, and your hosts are Dave Kranzler from investmentresearchdynamics.com and Rory Hall from thedailycoin.org. How you doing today, Dave?
I'm doing well, thanks. I guess we got John Embry teed up here. Why don't we just jump into it and get him on the line, because I know he's ready to rattle some chains.
Sounds good.
It's Dave and Rory. How's it going today?
It's boring.
Well, John, let's see if we can't shake it up a little bit for you.
It's the same old crap.
So, you commented the markets were boring, and we had a pretty big run up in the precious metals sector, and I'm writing my next issue of the Mining Stock Journal, and I was kind of reminding the subscribers, since mid-January, we had a over 100% gain in the Huey index in about 3.5 months.
It was actually at one point, Dave, it was about 138% at the peak.
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, admittedly, that's a spectacular run, but I've managed precious metals funds for, 20 years. And I can remember 5 or 6 occasions that my fund was up comfortably over 100% in less than 12 months. So this is the nature of the market. And I would go so far as to say that I had never seen the stocks cheaper than they were on January the 19th when they tried to pound the Huey through 100. And so, I mean, to me, even though we've had this great rally, I guess it's good we have some consolidation and pullback here. But the stocks are still not expensive, particularly if you have a reasonably optimistic view on the prices of the metals.
Oh, I completely agree with that. I mean, I guess my point is that, based on some of the emails I was getting from some of the subscribers, it was almost like they felt entitled to 50% gains a week in some of these junior mining stocks. And it did feel like it was. And I agree with you. I mean, this market could go straight up for a year and it would still be undervalued because of the last 5 years of downward pressure, manipulative pressure.
Well, the other aspect that probably doesn't get enough sort of discussion is it's a very small sector. So you take all the market cap, it's really tiny in comparison to other stocks and what have you. And secondly, nobody owns them. So consequently, if you ever get sort of focused back on gold and silver and people start trying to dig into the stocks, it's going to be spectacular. And that's why they have these massive moves. But I don't see much public participation yet other than the diehards.
Oh, I agree with that. And I also think, I think we're going to see this time around versus, let's just call it the 2001 to early 2011 period, the non-retail investors were primarily hedge funds.
Right.
There weren't that many shops around like Sprott that were, focused on this sector. There weren't many institutional type entities that focused on this sector. I think we're going to start seeing a broader range of institutional investors come into these names.
But, quite frankly, having looked at this sector for so long and looked at I spent a lot of time on the metal. And I can make the case, Dave, that, gold and silver may never have been cheaper than they are at the bottom in this cycle when you compare it to the amount of money or particularly debt in the world. And so to me, this move we've had so far this year is just it's like a rounding error, nothing yet. I mean, until gold and silver can break away from the clutches of the cartel, we're not going to see anything spectacular. But when it happens, and it will happen, it's going to be like night and day.
It is going to be like night and day.
I don't disagree with that. In fact, Rory brought up an interesting point. If you want to take over here, Rory.
Yeah, a couple of months ago, or no, not even that long ago, John Barrick Gold, I believe, it was one of the big mining companies, and they released released a statement regarding their production over the next 3 years. And according to the statement, they foresee a cut in production by up to 30%. And with that in mind, I mean, and as you know, demand for gold and silver have never been higher. And just like you were just saying, the price couldn't be any lower than it is right now. And how do you see silver in particular? How do you see the silver market playing out for the remainder of this year?
Well, Rory, that is a wonderful question. Silver is my absolute bête noire. I do not understand how they are accessing sufficient amount of physical at these prices to sort of meet the demand. There's something I don't understand, and I've talked to everybody, all the experts, and no one can come up with where the silver is coming from. Because I believe that when this whole thing breaks away from the clutches of J.P. Morgan, et cetera, I think it's going to be a classic cycle. I mean, gold's going to go up, but then this gold-silver ratio is going to collapse, and we're going to see a move in silver that will make the move back in the 70s look like nothing. But until it happens, nobody's going to believe it.
Yeah, and I'm really glad to hear you ask. That's been my favorite question, John, for 3 years. Where's the metal coming from? And,
I asked everybody, Rory, and I can't get an answer. And I mean, there's people that spend a lot more time on the actual mechanics of the silver market than I do, and they can't explain it.
Exactly. I've asked people literally around the world, and the best answer that I've been able to get is that the gold is coming from the central banks. And it's like, well, they're buying gold. If the central banks, on one hand, are acquiring more gold than they have in the last 15 years or whatever, that means that gold is just shifting from one central bank to another, and
that's correct.
And that means where's the rest of it coming from? I mean,
I have one thing that I'm sort of a conspiracy thinker, I guess, and like when they set up all these ETFs and everything, when you saw who the custodians were, they were the same guys that were suppressing the price.
Exactly.
So I'm very suspicious about, what's really in these ETFs, because I don't think the audits are particularly sound. And so consequently, I'm not sure that they don't use them as a source of physical supply when necessary, because that to me makes more sense than anything else I can come up with.
Thank you for bringing that up, John, because I was trying to jump in to say, to me, it's pretty obvious it's coming from SLV, the silver.
I think it has to be. There was one other theory that our mutual friend Murphy put forward, and it's just a speculation. He thought that when they ran the silver up to $50 back in 2011, J.P. Morgan accumulated a massive amount of physical, and that they'd been able to sort of use that to sort of make a fortune screwing around in the paper market and having enough physical available that they can sort of deal with that aspect of it. But that's a speculation. Who knows? But with no question, I think SLV is a major contributor to this.
Yeah, but there's only so much in that fund. I mean,
eventually, you're right.
Exactly.
Eventually, and that's what we're talking about. And what's so frustrating about this current period is that when the year started out, there was more and more discussion of the fact that physical inventories, above ground inventories, were being depleted at a rapid rate. And you could see pretty well what the mine production was, and the investment demand was picking up. And, a rational mind would have thought that by this time, we would have seen finally it break away from the grasp of the manipulators, but it hasn't happened yet.
And I wanted to go back. You mentioned getting away from the manipulators, and Deutsche Bank, as you are well aware, that whole situation with them coming out naming names and saying, yes, we've manipulated the markets and these are our co-conspirators. And now there's the blowback of the civil litigation against these different banks and different entities out there because of the manipulation that they've admitted to. And what kind of impact do you think that that's going to have in light of what we're talking about right now?
Well, I mean, if it was a rational world that wasn't run by a bunch of psychopaths, I would think it would have an enormous impact. But clearly, I mean, we keep seeing these, admissions of guilt and what have you. And now they've come up with the idea that these banks can be sued for manipulating the LIBOR market. And yet, we'll see where it leads. I mean, quite frankly, as I like to say when I get deeply frustrated, I'd much rather be playing our hand than theirs at this point. But so far, they've been able to stay in the game.
Do you think the Shanghai Gold Exchange is going to change that, or are they going to have any kind of impact, or are they in on the whole rigging game themselves?
Well, that's a good question. Like, I honestly do believe in the end that the Chinese and the Russians and the Eastern interests will eventually get in the position that they will be setting the price, and that physical demand will have a far greater impact than sort of what goes on now in the paper markets in the West. I mean, I knew when everybody got really excited about the Shanghai Exchange opening on April the 19th that these guys would move heaven and earth to make sure that was a non-starter, and that's what they've effectively done over the last few weeks. But yeah, I think over time it will have an enormous impact because the Chinese, like gold, they're accumulating mountains of it, even though they don't admit how much they've got, but they've got a lot more than they acknowledge. And I just think it's a matter of time. But if you're as desperate as these guys on the other side, the paper manipulators, I mean, you've got so many paper claims and so little gold, I'd be moving heaven and earth too to make sure nothing went wrong in the short term, because this could be a scandal of epic proportions.
Well, my whole theory has been since the early 2000s is that the U.S. would never let itself get into a position where what it's been doing with the precious metals is exposed to the world. I mean, they were almost exposed when Germany asked for its gold back.
Right.
And most people, this got lost in the shuffle when the 300-ton number was agreed to over 7 years. Germany originally asked for something like 650 tons back, about half of what the U.S. was supposedly safekeeping. And that got lost in the shuffle right away. But to me, that said it all. Okay,
of course it did.
Yeah, we want 300 tons back. Well, it's going to take us 7 years because of security reasons. Oh, well, Hugo Chavez didn't have too much trouble moving 160 tons to Venezuela from all over the world in 4 months.
Well, I think the problem, Dave, and you've identified it, is there are so many claims on each available ounce. And there may be a whole bunch of gold in the United States, but gosh knows how many claims there are on each ounce. And that's the problem. I don't know how I can't imagine this ending well for them, because this is why I don't understand why Rickards is talking about this $10,000 and $50,000 gold as if the Americans still have their 8,162 tons. So what are your thoughts on that? Because I'm baffled.
He wants, I mean, I was told from, I don't want to say his name here, but
okay, fine.
But John, you know who he is.
Yep.
He's a friend of Bill Murphy's, and I had dinner with him a couple of years ago, and we talked about Rickards, and he said Rickards is essentially a front for the Defense Department, and they know that the dollar, and they know the dollar's toast, and that's why they're pushing. That's why he's pushing the SDR so adamantly, because the dollar still is the majority of the SDR, and they know that if they can get the SDR in there, lose a little bit of control over everything. But I just think the U.S. is going to stir up a world war to avoid having to be exposed what's happened with the precious metals that it supposedly had in Fort Knox, and that it was supposedly safekeeping for all these other sovereign entities. I mean, it's been leased out.
Well, I totally agree with that. And your point, about starting a war somewhere to sort of get the focus off the subject is what really terrifies me. Is, I've mentioned to you on several occasions, I read Paul Craig Roberts' work with great interest, and he doesn't pull any punches. And then this was kind of supported the other day when I saw some general over in Britain who was big in NATO talking about there could be a nuclear war with Russia by 2017. It just made me cringe.
I saw that. I know my skin crawled.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Like, quite frankly, I mean, there are so many issues in the banking system and what have you at this point, that this sort of very quiet we're having now, this propping up of the Dow and other stock markets around the world, and the crushing of gold and silver prices really makes me think that there's something big on the horizon in the not too distant future, because this is eerie.
It's interesting that you just said that, because that's what we were going to ask you about next. Just today, Bill Gross was in the news saying that the system itself is at risk, and a day of reckoning is coming. And there's been several very high-profile, previously successful money managers who have come out just in the last few weeks and said something isn't right. This is not going to end well. There's a really bad event coming. How do you see this playing out?
Well, that's very interesting you'd say that, because they are a lot of the real deans in the business with spectacular records. Druckenmiller and these, and even Soros is allegedly piling in some gold. But the fact is that these people have been around for a long time. I've got this theory that the vast majority of people that are in the investment business today got in after 1982. And that's when the financial asset inflation started. Volcker crushed the inflationary psychology when he drove rates to 18%. And then afterwards, when the inflationary psychology was quelled, they started pumping money, and people weren't paying much attention to it, but it started to lift the financial markets. And, the bond market bottomed in 81. I remember it was yesterday. And the stock market bottomed in 82. And then after the crash in 87, they made them really nervous, and they would not take a recession willingly, or they wouldn't take any real stock market corrections. So consequently, everybody that's operating in this world that's younger thinks this is normal. And I don't believe it's normal at all. I think this is a financial asset inflation, which is going to end horribly.
Do you think, there's I know some guys, and our common friend Ian Gordon thinks that something really ugly is going to happen by the end of the summer. And you and I were kind of debating last year whether or not the system would make it for Super Bowl 50, because you wanted to add 50 to your resume, so having seen the previous 49, and I've seen most of them, not quite that many, but do you think we could see something happen before the elections?
Well, that's a really good question, because I talked to a number of people, and they claim that a lot of what's being done right now is to sort of get us safely to the elections, so the powers that be can get the right person in there. In this case, I suspect that's Clinton in their view. And I don't know. Ian Gordon, who I know well, is the long-term psycho guy, the Kondratiev. And if you look at the Kondratiev wave and everything, we should have already rolled over in a big way. What I think, and I've been sort of harping on this for some time, is there's been so much amazing financial innovation due to the power of computers, with the algorithms, high-frequency trading, the massive explosion in derivatives, that they've been able to take this and stretch this out infinitely longer than the rational mind would have thought several years ago. But that doesn't mean it won't end badly. But trying to put a date on the end is very difficult, because they've stretched it out a lot further than I thought they could originally.
And it's not a very good use of time, in my opinion, as far as picking an actual end date, because like we've been talking about throughout this whole conversation, it's everything's manipulated, and why wouldn't they be able to put another Band-Aid on it and kick it down the road for another month or another year?
Well, that's absolutely right, Rory. That's why anybody that sort of puts a date and a solid prediction in the same sentence may be making a mistake. But the fact is that if you look at this world today, look at the financial structure, look at the amount of debt, and look at how little firepower these guys have left, and all the sovereigns who sort of bailed out the banking systems the last time are now broke themselves.
Exactly. When
this thing goes this time, I don't know what they can do other than create unlimited liquidity and lead to a global hyperinflation, which in my mind is worse. I'm a big believer in Austrian economics, and it's all a debt-driven phenomenon. And I would have taken a recession / depression 20 years ago. And so we could have, moved on in a positive way. They've just stretched this out dramatically. And the end is going to be, I don't see how you can avoid something really tragic.
I would agree with that. And you mentioned Hillary and that being the choice of the establishment. And I agree wholeheartedly. I've been on record for a while saying that regardless of anything, that she's going to be put in office. She will not be elected, but she will be in office.
Well, and she's their person, Rory. So
right.
I wouldn't disagree with you. I don't know what the public thinks. I mean, at this point, like I've never seen anything like this, quite frankly, and I've always followed U.S. politics.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about that if you don't mind, John. I want to turn to the U.S. politics for just a moment, and I've actually got a couple of questions. I'm torn on which one to ask you. Because Hillary, I mean, it appears that the handcuffs are actually moving a little closer to her wrist at this point, and her treasonous acts may actually be brought to light over the next few weeks or months. And how does she wiggle her way out of this one, or does she? I mean,
well, that's an excellent question. I mean, like if it were sort of a law and order society, like maybe it was once, I mean, she would have already been out of the picture. Exactly. I mean, the fact that she's still sort of a viable candidate with all of, things that have been alleged amazes me. But this is what the powers that be, the elites, whatever you want to call them, that's their candidate, and she's going to do what they want. And that's the thing that troubles me on this whole neocon front, because she is a supporter of the neocon movement.
Big time. And last question on this along these lines. And what are your thoughts regarding the recent upswing in absolute total violence at the Trump rallies?
That's very frightening. I mean, Trump is one of the most polarizing figures on the planet. I think probably if he were elected, which I find it hard to believe he would be, but if he is elected, I think he's more of a pragmatist. But that isn't what they want in there. I don't think he takes orders well. So this is really a very, very difficult time for the United States on the political front. And it's coming at a time when the economy, I believe, is giving ground despite all the bogus economic numbers that are coming out.
As you probably are aware, John, since you follow Dr. Roberts' work so closely, Russia recently offered once again to work with the U.S. in fighting terrorists. And after a few days, and I believe it was yesterday or the day before, the State Department's John Kerry said thanks, but no thanks. Why wouldn't the U.S. want to work with anyone that is willing to help and fight these terrorist acts being perpetrated around the world? I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me.
Well, the terrifying sort of conclusion from that is that everything Paul Craig Roberts is saying is true. And they don't want to be aligned at all with Russia. They want Russia as the bet and wire that has to be beaten. And that's the only rationale I can see for it. Now, I don't think it's a very good one, but that seems to be the case.
I think part of it is, in a sense, if they join Russia to fight the so-called terrorists over in Syria, they're basically the U.S. would basically be attacking the terrorist force that it created, right?
Well, there's an element of that too. But I'm not a great admirer of Putin. I think he was, originally a bit of a thug. But I honestly don't think that he has any territorial designs on the Baltic. I think what he's done, protecting his flank in the Ukraine and taking the Crimea to, keep his warm water port, they were totally rational moves. And basically, they'd given them to the Ukraine in the first place. So I think that this whole movement to make Russia the bad guy is wrong. And that's what frightens me, because it looks like they're trying to stir something up. And the last thing we need is a nuclear war. It's nice to see Obama's over in Hiroshima, and they're sort of talking about no more nuclear wars ever, which seems to be at odds with some of the philosophies that are being, mentioned.
Well, if I hope that that doesn't play out the way that the rest of his rhetoric has, which is the exact opposite of what he says.
I
I mean,
know.
usually if he says that the sun is shining, you better look out the window to make
It's
sure,
raining. Yeah.
which is,
I think maybe immediate turn this back to precious metals, an immediate question, and then we can wrap this up, John, because I've been getting this question a lot. You know, we've seen I kind of term it a healthy pullback, even though we know it was obviously stimulated or triggered by manipulation. And I actually tie it to about 2 weeks ago when the Fed had started coming out and threatening us with rate hikes. You know, and gold goes down and the S&P stays flat or moves higher.
Yeah, it's interesting, all this talk about rate hikes. I think we've sort of speculated on it. Like, is it dollar related? You think it's more gold related? I still think they're very worried about the vulnerability of the dollar.
I agree. I think they're trying to maintain the dollar and the S&P within a range because they can't let the dollar get too high because it chokes off exports even more.
Absolutely, it's a classic balancing act because they can't let it get too weak and they can't let it get too strong. So consequently, they just got to keep it sort of in the middle. It's a great challenge considering how overowned the dollar is and the fact that it really isn't worth a whole lot when you look at the whole debt scene in the United States.
That's right. But I think they also, if you go back to Exeter's pyramid, the crux of the world global economic system is gold and silver. And I think that with this recent run up in the precious metals and the mining stocks, and it's started to really become a runaway freight train, and possibly beyond their control. I think they tell these guys to come out and threaten with rate hikes because they know the knee-jerk reaction of the market is going to be to sell their speculative gold positions, which means, the hedge fund algos will be dumping their paper gold, and that's what pushes the market lower.
I think that's I would not dispute that sort of rationale. They can't let gold and silver break away because that would sort of be the tell on the fact that their monetary policies are absurd. So consequently, we're going to continue to sort of, dance around in this area. As I've said recently on several occasions, we're either going to stay in this trading range longer than we would like, or when it ends, we're going to explode to the upside. And I know the explosion's coming. I wish I could tell you it was tomorrow.
I wish you could too.
Well, I guess, do you think that we've seen, like in terms of this current pullback, and obviously we got a revised GDP number tomorrow, and I'm sure it's going to be rigged to beat the expectation, and I think they're going to do one more attempted washout of the sector. But do you think we've largely got the bulk of this particular pullback behind us?
Yeah, I think we do, Dave, for the simple reason that, this stuff is so cheap now. I don't think they want to push it too far because it will strain their physical supplies. And they've got it down, $80 off the recent high. Silver, $1.50, $2 off the recent high. Quite frankly, I'm surprised they could get it this far. And I am impressed by our opposition. They've got a lot of firepower in the short term.
It's taken a lot of work to get that little bit of a move downward.
It's taken a lot more work each time. You're absolutely right, Rory. And that, to me, is a very positive sign.
Yes.
And the thing that would undo them, and you can't predict it, is a black swan of some description that we probably haven't even thought of. It comes out of left field. It won't be Deutsche Bank. Everybody knows about Deutsche Bank. But there's something in the system that they lose control of that we haven't even thought of at this point.
That's funny you bring that up because I was just discussing that very same thing with a colleague just a few days ago. I said there's a black swan that's going to hit that none of us have even imagined is in the realm of possibility right now.
I think it's just logical because there are so many things that could go wrong in an over-leveraged situation. There's never been remotely this much leverage in the system in any time in history. And an accident will be catastrophic.
Well, Rory, do you have anything else, or should we let John get on with his day?
I think we should probably allow John to get back to contemplating tonight's basketball game or the next
Good morning.
basketball game.
Well, it's a real pleasure to talk to you guys. It's, there's so few of us that sort of want to deal with reality. It's nice to talk to other people that, share the same opinion. Okay, take care, guys. Nice to chat.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.
You bet.